I'm going to assume that almost everybody here knows there were recent elections in Israel. I'm going to assume that some of you have very strong opinions on the elections. I'm going to assume some of you know less. So what I thought I would do at the outset is talk a little bit about the background, the long, deep background to the most recent elections. One of the interesting things about coverage of the election last week is that Netanyahu was reelected, I guess, for his fourth separate time as Prime Minister of Israel. And yet this very familiar, yet controversial figure, when elected for the fourth time, commanded national and international attention, much more so, I think, than the three previous elections. I'll talk a little bit later on about why I think this election, as opposed to the previous ones, has achieved such controversy and recognition. But before I do that, I want to talk some about what Zionism is, disagreements within Zionism, and the kind of deeper structure, I think, to ideological, cultural, ethnic, to Israeli politics. Most Americans, insofar as they know Israeli history, know it essentially a history of European Jews, typically from Ukraine, Poland, maybe Russia, beginning to settle in Mandate Palestine in the 1920s and 1930s. There were a smattering of settlers in the first decade of the 20th century. Prior to that, in the 19th, the centuries before then, most of the Jews, of whom there were few in the Holy Land, were deeply religious. They were not Zionists in the ideological sense, at least not at the time. The Jews that started arriving in the teens and 20s, again, typically coming from the eastern parts of Europe, were typically committed socialists. Their idea was to build a society that would be Jewish from top to bottom. They were coming out of a particular interpretation of the sources of anti-Semitism in Europe. From Herzl onward, there developed a different understanding of what had caused anti-Semitism. Their argument was that anti-Semitism had comparatively little to do with religion. The reason why Jews were marginalized and excluded, and one of the real catalyzing events for all this was the Dreyfus Affair in Paris, in France, in the late 19th century. The reason for the Dreyfus Affair, the reason more broadly from the estrangement of Jews from the mainstream of Jewish liberal, national, democratic, capitalist society, according to Zionism, was because Jews weren't a religion. Jews were an ethnic group, and they were an ethnic group that was incipiently national. The Jewish crisis was caused for Herzl and his followers by the fact that Jewishness was really a nationality. And the problem for a Jew in France, the problem for a Jew in Germany, in Austria, in Central and Western Europe, was that they were subject to charges of dual loyalty because, and this point was never hit hard, but was always imminent in the larger assessment, was because Jews really did have a dual loyalty. As Jews, they could not be fully French, they could not be fully Austrian, they could not be fully German. The solution to the Jewish question, therefore, became the establishment of a Jewish state. Now, the Jewish state was to be characterized by a couple distinctive features. One, at the outset, they kept the objective vague, but the objective was pretty clearly a Jewish state, ultimately. More broadly and more immediately, the idea was to build a society that would be Jewish from top to bottom. In one of the old lines, we don't want just Jewish physicists, we want Jewish criminals. Turns out they didn't want Marlevsky when they tried to come back, but the idea was that they wanted a society that would be fully Jewish, and by establishing a fully Jewish society, Jews would be normalized. For the first time ever, or more accurately for Zionists, for the first time in over 2,000 years, Jews would be not outsiders, not having to figure out how to negotiate relationship with a population which was alien to Jews. Jews would be fully, the society would be fully Jewish. Now, one of the interesting things about this tradition in Zionism, which I'm going to call labor Zionism, but you can call it social democratic Zionism or socialist Zionism. I'm not really concerned with how we name it. But one of the important features of this form of Zionism was that it made a fundamentally universalistic claim. The claim made by these Zionists was that Jews had no special right to a nation. All people had a right to the nation. Jews were a people, therefore Jews had a right to a nation, a state of their own. Just as Ecuadorians had, just as the Irish had, just as Italians had. It was a kind of claim that Jews were really a secular people. It was not a claim based on a special relationship to God. They don't use the language of the chosen people. They talk about a deep attachment to the land, and that kind of bleeds into problems eventually and later on. But at the outset, it was a kind of socialist claim. Now, the problem for labor Zionists, ideologically, in addition to all the problems with settling, building a society, negotiating the British, dealing with the Holocaust, Arab states around them, and so on and so forth. But ideologically, the problem was that labor Zionism was ill-equipped to deal ideologically with Palestinians. If all people have a right to a state, and if the claim that Jews have to a state of their own is that they're a people, then by that logic, Palestinians, if a people, deserve a state too. That led Israeli Zionists to all kinds of ideological contortions, the gist of which amount to the claim that Palestinians were not a people. Palestinians were just sort of nondescript Arabs, no different really than any other Arabs. So they can move to Jordan, or they can move to Egypt, they can move to Syria, Lebanon, wherever. They were just Arabs. They were not differentiated from other Arabs, and therefore labor Zionism has to see Arabs, at least had to until really the 1980s, had to see Arabs in what becomes Israel and really in what becomes the occupied territories as no different from Arabs, say, in Jordan. The problem for them, again, is if they see Palestinians as different, they have no claim to the land. Now, I'm not an historian of Arabs. I'm not a historian of Palestinians. I do, however, know a little bit about these kinds of conflicts in other societies, Ireland or South Africa, as you might have noticed from the introduction. And my own sense, which I think is fairly well grounded in the historic literature, is that what makes Palestinians different from other Arabs is precisely the encounter with Zionism. Even if it was true in 1910 that the Arabs in what becomes Israel or what becomes the occupied territories weren't much different from the Arabs in what becomes Syria or what becomes Lebanon, because all of these are still at this time part of the Ottoman Empire. Even if the Palestinians weren't different then from now, what made them different was the encounter with Zionism and all that follows from that. Now, why does this matter? It matters because labor Zionism founded the state. Labor Zionism dominated Israeli politics from 1948 until 1977 when Menachem Begin is elected. And labor Zionism in that period was never able to come up with a coherent position on Palestinians. Mostly because ideologically they could not recognize Palestinians as a collective group different from Jordanians, Syrians, Lebanese, what have you. Now, Netanyahu is not a labor Zionist. Netanyahu comes out of the tradition called revisionism. And revisionism is a much different tradition with a much different history. The key revisionist, the founder of revisionists, is a guy named Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky was much, frankly, despised by the Ben-Gurions of the labor Zionist tradition. Jabotinsky was disliked for a couple of reasons. He was coming out of Poland and was suspected of having kind of fascist tendencies, because there was a lot of fascism floating around Poland in the 1930s. More importantly, he had a different basis for the claim on the for Zionists to a state for Jews. His claim wasn't the Jews were like any other people, a people like any other people. All people have a right to the state, so Jews, by inference, have a right to the state too. His claim that Jews were special was that Jews were special, and they had a specific, unique, inviolable commitment to the land of Israel, and that for him included the holy parts that were then in what I'll call the West Bank. Now, the reason I think this matters is that Jabotinsky has no problem, A, recognizing the existence of Palestinians because he's not making a kind of universalistic claim to a state, and B, telling the Palestinians that they lose. It was a simple matter for them. This is ours. We are superior. Either God gave us this land, history gave us this land, our suffering in Europe gave us this land, whatever the particular justification is. For Jabotinsky, Israel or Jews deserved this land, whether or not Palestinians existed. Now, Jabotinsky was an important figure ideologically, not a powerful figure politically. His tradition was considered not marginal, but not really mainstream, and certainly not fully respectable in kind of conventional elite Israeli circles. This begins changing in the 1970s for two kinds of reasons. The first thing is that Israel, as many of you no doubt know, was conceived originally as a home for European Jews. But most of the Jews who were to live in Israel were killed in the Holocaust. So what happens in the 1950s and 60s is that it becomes a home for increasing numbers of Arab Jews from Iraq, from Morocco, from Yemen, from Tunisia, from wherever. When the Arab Jews start showing up, the kind of labor elites that tended to be Western, secular, modern, educated, did not look fondly upon the manners, the traditions, the authorities of the incoming Arab Jews. They regarded them, yeah, they're Jews, but they're not modern, they haven't had the Enlightenment, they need to be socialized, they need to be assimilated. We have to break down their attraction to rabbis, we have to modernize them, we have to make them like us. In some ways, it's not a whole lot different from what happens to a lot of immigrants coming to the United States, with this important distinction. Most immigrants who come to the United States assimilate over course of decades. Israel in the 1950s and 60s, seeing itself under siege by surrounding hostile Arab states, compressed what otherwise might have been a prolonged, extended process into a decade or two. They were not polite, they were not sensitive, and they often were accepted as more or less legitimate by the parents who brought their children from the Arab country into Israel. But this sort of Ashkenazi elite that oversaw what they thought would be the assimilation of Arab Jews into Israel, but in fact were promoting the integration of Arab Jews into Israel, found themselves, these Ashkenazi elites, much disliked by the children and the grandchildren of the Arab Jews. This matters for a couple reasons. One is this group of people does not like the Ashkenazi, does not like the kind of westernized, liberal, highly secular, kind of Caribbean, Mediterranean quality of life in, say, Tel Aviv. That's one problem. The other problem is there's more Arab Jews. Well, the other point is there's more Arab Jews than there are Ashkenazi Jews in Israel right now. Now, Menachem Begin, who's very much the follower, the disciple of Jabotinsky, was able to mobilize Arab Jews into what becomes one of the core constituencies of the right-wing coalition starting at, well, he was drawing their votes in the late 60s and 70s, but he achieves the breakthrough in 77. Since 1977, essentially, Ashkenazi Jews have inclined towards the Labor Party. Arab Jews have inclined more pronouncedly towards the Likud and other right-wing parties. The right thing gets reinforced by a couple other things. One, and I won't go into too much detail here, but the Yom Kippur War in 1973 discredited the labor political military establishment. The surprise attack, the near defeats on certain fronts, opened up the political spectrum to challenges from the right in a way that had never been possible before. The other thing that starts happening post-67, but growing in the 1970s, is the role of the settlements in Israeli electoral politics. The settlements started out under the auspices of the Labor Party. It started out as a kind of security measure, but before long, it gets claimed by the right wing, or it gets claimed by settlers who join the right wing as a continuation of Zionism, in fact, a certain elevation of Zionism, because like the original Zionist pioneers, these settlers were going to claim the land inch by inch, foot by foot, create, to Menachem Begin's term, facts that could not be eradicated. And whereas the original labor pioneers just did this in Tel Aviv or Haifa, they were doing it in the real Holy Land, in Hebron, in Jericho, in Jerusalem, the stuff that is of greater significance religiously and historically to many Jews. What you get, therefore, is a kind of growing coalition in the right wing with nationalists, with settlers, with Arab Jews, and with the constant spur of conflict from Palestinians intensifying, making more urgent the kind of security position of the right, which is essentially, we're insecure. The only way to make us more secure is to get more control. Now, labor looks at this and starts saying, well, we don't know what to say about it. They say, gee, we do not want to appear weak on the security issue. If we appear weak, we'll lose politically. More importantly, we do have enemies. And if we are weak in the face of our enemies, some of our people might get killed. So the kind of labor types want to say, gee, we need to take a strong security position. But what we need to do also, what the Labor Party, like Likud, is committed to is maintaining the Jewish character of Israel, whatever that means, and that's contested intensely in Israeli politics. But a Jewish state is insufficient for the Labor Party. The Labor Party also is committed to democracy. It wants elected governments. It wants the Knesset. It wants political campaigns. It wants what they had last week. And the third thing, which I think is a little different from democracy that labor is committed to, is liberal values. Constitutional rights, human rights, secularism, modernity, a certain kind of Enlightenment tradition, constitutional government, all these things that Americans call democracy, but I think are better called liberalism. The Labor Party wants both. Forget about democracy. What it wants is liberalism, and by which would include democracy, and Zionism. The thing of it is it's not, the Labor Party is becoming increasingly worried that both can't be combined given the trajectory of events in Israel. They're concerned with, first, the growth of the right wing. Second, the growth of, I haven't mentioned them thus far, the ultra-Orthodox, who are about 10% of Jews in Israel, but have a very, very high birth rate. I believe the average woman produces 10 children, and the average secular Israeli Jew woman would produce about 3. Not only is 10 more than 3, but at least judging from the secular women I've met in Israel, they tend to marry when they're about 30. The ultra-Orthodox women are marrying when they're about 18. So over the course of over a century, I say do the math because I can't. But you're going, at least not on the top of my head, but you're going to end up with a society that is increasingly not liberal on that side. The Labour Party has really no more use for Arab Jews than Arab Jews has for the Ashkenazi elite. And rightly or wrongly, Israeli liberals regard Arabs as not committed, Arab Jews, as not committed really and fully in the same way as they are to liberal values. The other problem is that Israeli liberals are not at all convinced that liberal values can be sustained given the constant occupation of the West Bank and also of Gaza. Gaza is a little different because Israel obviously doesn't have the commitment, and constituents in Israel don't have the commitment to holding Gaza that some of them have to holding the West Bank. But if you add the kind of tension coming from the realities of occupation in the West Bank to the demographic question, Israeli liberals are deeply despairing. That's what you're picking up in the New York Times. That's what you'd pick up if you read an Israeli newspaper written for English readers. This sort of deep angst that the Israel that they were raised in, the Israel they value, the Israel that was both liberal and Zionist, and that can't choose between its liberalism and its Zionism because it must be both. This Israel is threatened internally by Israelis who are not committed to the liberalism, and externally, and in some cases internally, by the Arabs who are not committed to the Zionism and maybe not the liberalism either. For the right, this is less of a problem. The right has elements that aren't liberal, they're not democratic. One, I don't know if any of you read the book, I always forget the title, Shavit. Promised Land. It sold like 12 zillion copies. My Promised Land. He's a very important columnist, an Israeli who writes for the paper that, more or less is their equivalent to the New York Times. It's the paper of record. It's secular. He's a very tortured soul in the book. I read a piece that he wrote a week ago reviewing the election and said, my goodness, 3/4 of the parties in Israel are not really democratic, or they have substantial non-democratic elements inside them. Certainly the religious parties don't aspire to democracy. They're controlled by rabbis. The Arab parties, well, I'm not sure that, and Shavit regards those as democratic. Some of the coalition partners of Netanyahu to his right aren't especially concerned with liberal rights, certainly not rights for those who are not Jewish inside Israel. You add all this together, and the Israeli kind of establishment, cultural establishment, intellectual establishment, ideological establishment, is panicked. They thought they would win this election. They thought they would win the election for a couple, 3 reasons. The main reason is they thought, reminds me a little of kind of Kerry in 2004. They thought they had found a set of issues that were sure to produce victory. They were going to run on economic grounds, pocketbook issues. Particularly, they were running on the price of apartments, which are very expensive in Israel, on the difficulty of young Israeli couples to get started in life, have a place for kids, due to the skyrocketing costs of rents, the skyrocketing costs of buying a flat, and the indifference of Netanyahu, who has, in addition to his right-wing kind of nationalist commitments, also is committed to increasing marketization of the Israeli economy. Because of these kind of complex of issues on the right, the Zionist Union, the Labor Party, thought that they could win by running a pretty straightforward pitch to pocketbook issues for your kind of mainstream Israeli voter. Add to that they were hoping, they wouldn't say it, but they were hoping that the 20% of the population that is Palestinian and allowed to vote in Knesset elections because they're Israeli citizens would turn out in substantial numbers. and that would create the basis for a coalition that would address both pocketbook issues and begin coming up with the peace deal with the Palestinians that would rescue Israeli liberalism from the threat posed by both illiberal Israelis and growing numbers of Arabs, if you count the Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza as part of Greater Israel. They thought there was a good chance they would win. They certainly did not think they were going to be routed. They lost decisively. They lost decisively for a couple of reasons. One has gotten a lot of play in the United States. Netanyahu made last-minute provocative appeals to, well, why do we call it racism? A lot of it's nationalism. He raised the specter of Arabs voting in order to increase his own vote. He renounced the two-state solution, which, frankly, I was surprised anybody had ever taken seriously from him, but he renounced it with the effect of convincing the secular labor voters that if you don't get the two-state solution, you'll forfeit the liberal values, which some of these people think aren't taken very seriously by Netanyahu in the first place. And he won by disrespecting Obama. Now, an absolute foundation of Israeli foreign policy since 1948, and especially since 1967, is the importance of the alliance with the United States and the importance of maintaining bipartisan support in the United States. Historically, until the Nixon administration, the Republican Party wasn't especially interested in Israel. Starting with Nixon and then accelerating with Reagan and then kind of consummating, I think, with Bush too, the Republican Party has become uncritical for the most part in its support for Israel, and especially in its support for the right-wing nationalist elements in Israeli politics. As a result, right-wing nationalist Israelis, and Netanyahu is the clearest example, have formed an open alliance with the Republican Party. If you remember, Netanyahu had all but endorsed Romney in the 2012 American elections. And this is worrying Israelis because they see, is worrying kind of the Labor Party Israelis because they see Netanyahu as jeopardizing the alliance as the cornerstone of Israeli security. So you add this together, you add fear on the part of kind of secular Israeli Ashkenazi elites with the way Netanyahu won the election, with his opposition to a two-state solution, with the belief that this was an opportunity to win due to favorable, from their vantage point, economic circumstances, with the belief that this was a turning point election because if they can't win now, they'll never manage to win, and if they don't win, there won't be a two-state solution. If there's not a two-state solution, then Israel will be forced to make the impossible choice between being a Zionist state and a liberal state. You add all this together, and they're panicked. And if you have any question, any evidence, you can read the Israeli press, or you can simply listen to what Israeli politicians are saying, or you could look at the New York Times coverage for a few days, which tends to reflect those kinds of sensibilities. There's another reason, though, why the Labor Party lost that has gotten a lot less attention, so I thought I would just mention it. It has been mentioned in Israel. If you divide the Israeli electorate by income deciles, in other words, the top 10%, the 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, and so on, the Zionist Union won only in the top 2 or 3 deciles. In other words, affluent Israelis voted Labor. Labor, which sees itself ideologically as reflecting Labor Party, social democratic values, the working man, the working woman, it lost in the middle class, it lost in the lower middle class. When I looked at these numbers, it struck me how familiar these numbers look. They really look much like what's happening to the Democratic Party in the United States. That the Labor Party is seen as endorsing a kind of set of cosmopolitan values that purport to be concerned with the economic circumstances of ordinary Israelis, but really are more concerned in the eyes of the critics and in the eyes of kind of the middle or middle classes with winning the approval of the right sort of Israelis in Tel Aviv and the right sort of Europeans in the New York Times. But for these people, as for many kind of lower middle class whites in the US, thinking about the Democratic, but for these people, the Labor Party doesn't really care. Either doesn't really care about people like them or can't really do much about the price of real estate in Tel Aviv anyway, or is economic appeals are outweighed by what's seen as a vacillating security policy. Whatever the particular inflection of the reason why particularly Israelis in the bottom 7 deciles did not vote for the Labor Party, the fact is they didn't. And that portends very, very badly for the future of the Labor Party. If the Labor Party becomes essentially a party of the well-educated professional class and some Arab allies, they'll lose the kind of center of Jewish opinion, and they will be consigned to minority status indefinitely. So I think what actually happened last week is three things. The first thing is that labor got repudiated on a kind of pocketbook, meat and potatoes, no frills, socioeconomic campaign in circumstances that labor electoral strategists thought would favor such a campaign. This is not like Mondale in '84 when they knew they were going to lose. This is the one they thought they could win. That's the first thing. Second thing is that labor is being haunted by the demographics of the Jewish population in Israel is very adverse to labor. You got 10% or more is ultra-Orthodox. You got a big chunk that is Arab, and they are not particularly open to the kinds of appeals that labor makes. Labor sees itself as a cosmopolitan party embracing liberal values. But the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab Jews either are rejecting the liberal values or regard the liberal values just as the cultural valiance of elites that they dislike for other kinds of reasons. So the second kind of reason, I think, for the defeat of labor and the victory of the right is because of a kind of deeper demographic forces. The third thing is that Netanyahu knew what he was doing when he made the quasi-racist, nationalistic rejection of the two-state solution at the last minute. What Netanyahu realized, and what labor has since come to see was insightful, is that these are winning issues. That Israeli voters, or at least the kinds of Israeli voters who otherwise might not have voted, are highly susceptible to nationalist, religious, quasi-racial appeals. And in surveying that reality, the kind of secular Ashkenazi elites that really do still see Israel as theirs feel like they've lost. They didn't lose an election, they've lost a country. And the kinds of values that made Israel what it is for them are in deep jeopardy and unlikely to prevail unless something very fundamental happens. And Netanyahu, as he said on the eve of the election, is not going to let happen the kind of two-state solution that the Labor Party needs to believe is possible in order to rescue Israeli liberalism from what they see as the costs of Israeli nationalism in the occupation. So with that, I thought I would take questions, comments, spitballs, whatever you got.
So notwithstanding the concern about the demise of liberalism and aspects of democracy in Israel, you have a validation based upon demographics and what this last election showed of a democratic result. Many people may not like it, but it seems like overwhelmingly Israelis, notwithstanding the Ashkenazi labor, small percentage, Israelis are in favor of Netanyahu's stern policies toward permanent acquisition of the territories and everything that changed since 1967.
Yeah, I don't think that I disagree with that. I think that's actually why, though, it's important to draw a distinction between democratic values and liberal values. If democracy means something like popular sovereignty and involves elections and majorities ruling, you can certainly claim that you may have Zionism, and Israel may be both Zionist and democratic. But if Israel also believes in issues of individual rights, constitutional government, secularism, equality under the law, other kind of classic liberal values, then Israeli liberals, I think, do have grounds for worry. Now, I would add this. I've always, I first kind of got interested in Israel in a serious way in the mid-1980s. And then other things happened and I lost interest and kind of got interested in it again about 5-10 years ago. But when I first started studying it, there was this guy named Mevin Benvenisti who gets very little play outside of Israel and very little play in Israel, but I think is one of the most important analysts of Israel. Benvenisti is your classic Ashkenazi Jew. He was, I believe, a paratrooper in the '67 war. His father is the guy who drew up all the maps that renamed the Arab towns in Hebrew that are taught to Israeli school children. Benvenisti writes a book about that. And Benvenisti became vice mayor, deputy mayor, whatever it's called, of Jerusalem after '67. In the early '80s, he got a lot of money from, was the Ford Foundation, I believe, to do a series of studies called the West Bank Data Project. And what Benvenisti was arguing by the mid-'80s was that there was no serious possibility that Israel was going to go along with a two-state solution, or really that Palestinians would accept a two-state solution. That Israel, in Begin's fashion, had created facts, settlements, roads, irrigation projects, and more importantly, a conception of greater Israel that made it very difficult, if not impossible, for Israel to abandon the West Bank. Gaza might have been different, in the context of Israeli democracy. That just wasn't going to happen, even without Palestinians who, for their own reason, might have an interest in getting more than Israel would offer without these Palestinians damaging negotiations. So Benvenisti had been arguing for 25 years that the two-state solution just wasn't in the cards. It served a lot of interest. It served the interest of the United States to believe that a diplomatic solution was possible. It served the interest of Israeli liberals to believe that a solution that would avoid the dangers of Arab majorities was possible if you assume Israel isn't going to give up the West Bank and Gaza. And I've always thought, I don't know that I was sure that Benvenisti was right, but I always thought it was a serious point. I think what's changed in the last week in Israel is the fear that Benvenisti is right, that there's not a two-state solution. Now, I also think that Israelis, like other people, are going to remake their conception of the world to make it more tolerable to daily life. So a lot of the people who see the end of liberal values on the horizon will reconsider over the next year or two as things calm down and life normalizes. But I've always thought it was interesting that Benvenisti's work was generally ignored or regarded as something people didn't want to engage by both Israelis and Palestinians. Because both Israelis and Palestinians historically have needed the belief that there was a solution that would allow them to get what they want, in large measure because they had no idea what to do otherwise. What I think that this election has opened up for many Israelis is the possibility that they're going to need to think seriously about what to do next because the old ideas are exhausted. The problem is the obvious alternative, a one-state solution, is unacceptable to almost all Israelis. I guess unacceptable to most Palestinians, but I can imagine some Palestinians changing their mind. And even if it became acceptable to some Palestinians, many Palestinians, that would not make it acceptable to most Israelis. And frankly, I think it would be quite a challenge to get Palestinians and Israelis to live under one set of political institutions in whatever you want to call it, Israel-Palestine. But the reason I think why the sort of Ashkenazi elites are so panicked right now is that which they needed to believe in seems to have been dashed and have no alternatives. In other words, they're living where Benvenisti has lived for the past 30 years. Yeah.
In your opinion, what event or pressure could turn this tide? Could turn back towards liberalism, could turn back towards the quest for a two-state solution, could enhance the liberalism that was existing in Israel and enhance the power of the Labor Party?
Well,
what war events?
Well, there's two kinds of ways I could see that happening, and I'm not predicting that it would happen either if either of these two things happened, and I'm not going to predict that either of these two things would happen. But the first thing would be to change the relationship of the ultra-Orthodox to the state. One of the things that drives almost all secular Israelis nuts, and I'm talking right-wing as well as left-wing, is the status of the ultra-Orthodox parties. I don't know how to put it. I don't know how many of you have been to Israel, but most Israelis, secular Israelis, kind of feel, in American terms, like sort of left-of-center Democrats, capital D Democrats. But when they start talking about the ultra-Orthodox, I grew up in California, they sound exactly like Ronald Reagan did as governor. They're welfare cheats, they don't work, they're lazy, they won't serve in the military, they reject all the meaningful institutions of the state. They not only won't defend Israel from threats by joining the army, but they exempt themselves from the kind of very important socializing role played by the Israeli army. They do all these things, and because they very often, including now, have the balance of power between the center-left and the hard right, they get to write their tickets. As long as they can write their tickets, you have a 10 to 15% voting bloc of in the Knesset that is inclined to go along with the nationalist right, and makes it that much harder for the kind of liberals to become a majority. And the only way, I don't see that changing, but if something should happen such that they lose their kind of exempt status from the consequences of their actions, and a lot of the secular Israelis would like that to happen, I think that could affect the balance of power inside Israel. Second thing that could happen, I actually have a second, is if Palestinians fundamentally change their politics or their strategies. If Palestinians fundamentally change their political objectives and strategies. I think it was mentioned, I started off when I was a graduate student doing the conflict in Northern Ireland. And what triggered that conflict has been forgotten by everybody, but I think me. It was a civil rights movement, patterned very much after the American civil rights movement. Northern Ireland was a highly sectarian society. Protestants dominated, the Catholic minority was marginalized. And it was very kind of fixed relationship. The Protestants had a 2-to-1 majority. Catholics had higher birth rate, but they had higher immigration rates. So Protestant parties used the threat of Catholics to guarantee their supremacy. And since most Catholics aspired to some kind of unification of Ireland, when Catholics acted politically, they cemented Protestant solidarity, and the 2-to-1 majority prevailed. What upset that kind of stability was a civil rights movement that basically said, well, we Catholics in Northern Ireland really didn't want to be part of the United Kingdom. We really want to be part of a united Ireland. We feel Irish, but we get that is not going to happen. We are British citizens by law give us our rights under the British Constitution, treat us equally. Turned out that absolutely flipped out Protestants. They knew how to deal with nationalists, they knew how to deal with IRA. What they did not know how to deal with is recognition of the legitimacy of the Northern Irish state. And they fragmented and they rioted, and that then triggered the stuff that led to the revival of the IRA and so on and so forth. I've always wondered what would happen if Palestinians said, you know, hey, Israel was founded in 1948. This is what now, 2015? That's 67 years ago. Israel was founded. For 19 years, the West Bank, less than one third, almost only a quarter of Israel's history did you not control the West Bank. Like it or not, the West Bank is part of Israel. I can imagine Palestinians saying, don't like this. We would rather have a state of our own, but we're not going to get one. And we're certainly not going to get one by sending suicide bombers into pizza joints in Tel Aviv. So here's the deal. You've incorporated de facto the West Bank into Israel. We've read our Benvenisti. You've been doing this systematically. Netanyahu has made clear that we don't get a state of our own. We wish we would get one. We're not. We're going to do what the Northern Irish Catholics did in the late 1960s, and we're going to demand equal rights under Israeli law. Now, I don't think the Palestinians are on the verge of saying that. I think there'd be a whole lot of danger to the Palestinians who did say it. Some say it. There are Palestinian political figures who make that kind of argument. I think it would be dangerous for the Palestinians who are in the forefront of such an argument, but I do think that that kind of position might unsettle the kind of patterns of Israeli politics. The third thing that would change it is if American policy changed. And I mean, this was a wonderful story yesterday or the day before in the New York Times, basically saying, well, it's time for the U.S. to make up. It's time for Obama to make up with Netanyahu. He did what he had to do to be elected, and sure, he's been doing this. But the important thing is that Obama needs to surrender to Netanyahu because essentially that's what Netanyahu wants. And Netanyahu's allies want it. And even some Israelis who are not Netanyahu's allies want it. I don't know if people saw this story, but it was a classic New York Times story. In that, let's not let the past interfere with what needs to be done right now. I actually suspect that I think that the conflict between Obama and Netanyahu is real, and I think it will be enduring. But if and when Hillary Clinton is nominated by the Democratic Party, and if and when whoever is nominated by the Republican Party, I think there'll be a bipartisan effort to let bygones be bygones and go back. I actually think that's damaging to Israeli liberalism. I think if you're committed to liberal values in Israel, what will revive them or sustain them is a reality check. What's most dangerous to kind of core liberal values in Israel is the ability of Israel to get away with policies that are sustainable in the short term, probably sustainable in the medium term, but not sustainable in the long term. First time I went to Israel, I met this guy. Actually, I'd read his books. He was a South African. This is the late 80s. And at this stage, Israel had few friends and South Africa had fewer. And so there was a lot of contact between white South Africans and Israel. So I heard this talk by a pretty prominent South African academic and Afrikaner historian, Herman Hilimi is his name, who I'd read but I never met. And I happened to be just walking down. He was at Hebrew University. And, Jerusalem, downtown Jerusalem has, all these cafes. It's very Mediterranean. And I just see him eating alone. So I kind of summoned my courage and walked up and introduced him. He was a very nice man. He was happy to have somebody to talk to. And we started talking. We later became friends. But what I remember him saying at that first meeting is, well, obviously I still remember, I just said, is something I've never forgotten, which is, and he's speaking as a South African white Afrikaner who isn't by no means hostile to Israel and was kind of liberal in South African political terms. What he said is what Israelis don't understand is once the occupation gets in their bloodstream, it's going to be very, very difficult to clear out. And again, this was said 25 years ago. Heliomi was not the only person to say it. I happen to remember him saying it that one day. And I think that what has allowed Israel to get away with policies that I think are reckless is the unqualified support of the United States. The United States has exempted Israel from what might be called reality checks because the United States believes that Israel will negotiate if it feels secure and will not negotiate if it doesn't feel secure. And I mean, again, I did Northern Ireland, I've done South Africa. I think it works the exact opposite way. If you don't have to negotiate, you don't. You negotiate because you must. And insofar as the United States insulates Israel from the costs of stalemate and the costs of not negotiating, it reinforces the right, no matter how many times John Kerry tells Israelis that it's really in their interest to negotiate. So the three things I would say could change it is some unlikely change in Israeli politics around the status, the political influence, the leverage of the ultra-Orthodox, something about Palestinians changing their demands from those that reinforce Israeli solidarity into something that could open up questions in new and different ways, or the U.S. reorganizing policy. I wouldn't bet on any of them. And even if one happened, I don't know if it'd be sufficient.
It seems that, unlike the Northern Ireland situation, which I do remember seeming to be totally unsolvable at the time, notwithstanding patterns of American civil rights, but I remember many of us in that era thought that this was akin to the Israeli-Palestinian situation as it was then. But it does seem now that there are so many connections, so many tiers of influence and spheres of influence among the Palestinians regarding what's going on in the rest of the Arab world, that it is quite different from the Northern Ireland situation was then, as hard as that seemed to be, because you're dealing with total change in Arab politics, radicalism, extremism, the scenario that you painted where the Palestinians would like to see them shrugging their shoulders and say, well, we have a fait accompli, we'll just go ahead and become Israeli citizens, they'll be nice to us. It seems that's infinitely more difficult now because of what we've seen in the last 3 years in the Arab world.
Oh yeah, plus nobody cared about Northern Ireland except those who lived there and a few Irish people in the Republic. And, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is front page news anytime there's a development. It's an important issue in American politics. It's a very important issue in Arab nationalism. It's your classic political football. And almost everybody has more gains to be registered by kicking the football than by coming up with a solution. But it's also it's hard for me to envision what a solution would look like at this stage.
Excuse me. Isn't there a greater picture that some people tend to ignore, and that is similar to the Hatfields and the McCoys and the Shias and the Sunnis and the Serbs and the Croats? There are certain things that are so deeply ingrained that they don't allow people to get beyond that, even though it may be for their own betterment. And sometimes when you have a situation like that, the surrounding communities have difficulty. For example, Albert even said that the PLO never lost an opportunity to lose an opportunity. So theoretically, they could have been a state a long time ago because it was offered to them and they didn't take it. But to keep the pot boiling amongst the Israelis and the Palestinians, the surrounding Arab states are insulating themselves against what may be fallout by having the focus on Israelis and Palestinians, rather than have any spattering on their own shoes, so to speak. Right now, the Saudis have been funneling money to the terrorists to keep them away. They've been funneling money to extreme Islamists by having, in certain areas around the world, places of worship that they will fund in order to keep the eye off of them. A lot of these countries are family businesses, and they don't want their business to be interrupted. So if you keep it going and keep the eye off of them, it's to their advantage. Well, I felt badly for Jordan, because Jordan seems to want to have a solution and not have the perpetuation of the Palestinian problem. But unfortunately, they were stuck with also the sectarianism and assassination of the grandfather, and Hussein being afraid he would have the same problem. But it is so entwined between sectarianism, hatred, and self-interest that it becomes almost impossible, because every time you're ready to find an answer to one question, something else comes up to get in the way, because the self-interest is the basic problem. And with that, you're dealing with human nature. So the question is, will it ever end? Can it end? In my opinion, probably never, because people don't change that easily. And as long as it's to your benefit to keep these things going, you're going to keep doing it.
I think there's a lot to that. And I'm not usually considered an optimist on much of anything, and I would not consider myself an optimist on Israeli-Palestinian matters. But I would say a few things. What's that old line, necessity is the mother of invention? I do think that almost everybody is self-interested. Politics is almost always self-interested. The point I would make about Israel is that I do think it's in Israel's interest to make a deal with the Palestinians. I think what the South African happened to mention to me 25 years ago is right. The longer Israel holds the West Bank, the worse it is for Israel, independently of Palestinians on the West Bank. Your comments about the Arab states were absolutely right. They've been exploiting this since about 1948. A little less recently, because most of the Arab states near Israel have more urgent matters. Syria is not a state at this stage. Iraq's not really a state. The Saudis, is it a state when it's named after a family? I mean, Canada's not named after a family. France isn't named after a family. The Saudis are named after a family, and they're really...
At least they're honest about that.
Yes, well, and they have a very unusual succession method. But I think right now the Arab states are not particularly threatening to Israel because they're essentially disintegrating, and so can't really play a particularly effective obstructionist role. Syria often has, especially Saddam did. And sometimes Palestinians who are interested inside the PLO in entertaining possibilities of working with Israel would be assassinated by Saddam's people. That happened. The other point you mentioned Jordan, and that reminds me of one of the points I forgot to make earlier. When I was talking about Jabotinsky, and how Jabotinsky was different from labor Zionism, how revisionists had a different conception of Palestinians, where they could accord Palestinians national status and just say, you lost. Jabotinsky had a slogan, which is Jordan is Palestine. And on the basis of that and little more, I think that is the deep-seated, unsayable belief of the Israeli right. Jordan is Palestine. And the solution to Israel's demographic issues, the solution to the national aspirations of Palestinians is to make Jordan the Palestinian state. There are, however, a couple problems with that. One is the Jordanian monarchy does not want to be a Palestinian state. Two is the Bedouins in Jordan don't seem to want to be a Palestinian state. And three, the United States and also Britain, which has this attachment to Jordan, do not want Jordan to become a Palestinian state. Which doesn't mean it can't happen. Jordan is hardly a stable state at this stage. It manages to dodge trouble, but look how frightened they are by ISIS. Look how much they depend really on kind of protection from Israel. Again, it's one of those things neither can really say, but everybody knows that Israel regards Jordan as useful. And as much the best outcome for that territory. But I could imagine the right wing believing that Jordan is Palestine, and I wouldn't rule that out. Not in my lifetime do I expect to see it, but the future, one hopes, is going to be very long. And I could see, not that I want this to happen, I'm not saying I want Jordan to become Palestine, but I do think the Israeli right still sees that as the real solution, just one they can't articulate in polite company.
Yes. There's talk among European Jews, particularly in France, but not limited to France, about leaving Europe, the need to leave Europe. And while I'm sure some would aspire to come to the U.S. Or Canada, if a significant number were to go to Israel, would that have not a demographic impact, but a political impact?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think there are very many Jews in France. The influx that made a big difference recently was the Russian Jews, which is tricky because it's not said too often. But it's not clear how many of the Russian Jews or whether all the Russian Jews really were Jews. Some might have just been people who wanted out of Russia, realized they could get to Israel if they could come up with a plausible claim that they were Jewish. I don't think that I could imagine French Jews moving to Israel, but I'm not sure what percentage of the French population is Jewish. I'm not sure.
I think it's the third largest Jewish population in the world.
Is it?
After
It's
the
about
U.S.
6
and
or
Israel.
8,
About
between
50,000
6 and
about 50,000 in the
700,000.
Jewish population of France.
50, 50?
About 50,000.
50,000, and the Israeli population is around, what, 9 million? 8.5, 9 million?
No, demographically it wouldn't have a big impact, but politically,
Well, I don't think that's close to a drop in the ocean. And Israelis, are clearly open to Jews who immigrate, but I don't think they're particularly open to having their national politics changed. Now, the Russians kind of did change it. There were a lot of Russians, and they formed their own party. And unlike previous waves of Jewish immigrants into Israel, they kind of maintained their ethnic ties and never really got assimilated. One of the things, if you kind of read Israeli scholars now, political scientists, sociologists, one of the interesting things, it used to be if you read a book on Israel, the unstated premise is that Israel is a unique society and it doesn't help to know anything about anything else. All you need to know is that which is specific to Israel, Jews, and maybe Arabs. In the past 20 years, Israeli scholars have done a lot more work kind of locating Israel inside world trends. And one of the kind of interesting ideas that you see in a lot of Israeli social science is the idea that what's really going on in Israel is that a sort of Ashkenazi. The idea was that Israel, from its foundation, since the pre-state period through the foundation into the 21st century, was dominated ideologically by the sort of old Ashkenazi elite, which is a funny elite because it wasn't particularly rich. It doesn't dominate the economy exactly. What it dominates are institutions, the military, universities, prestigious newspapers, that kind of thing. And this sort of kind of professional class exerted a kind of powerful role in defining what it meant to be Israeli. What these kinds of authors are saying is that what's going on really in Israel is that the influence of these elites has been displaced. But instead of being replaced by another kind of elite that can redefine what it means to be an Israeli, the Israeli identity has just become fragmented. So you have the old Ashkenazi elite, and again, the book, My Promised, what's the title? My Promised Land. I teach it, I just can't remember the title. It's an excellent illustration of it. The Arab Jews, the ultra-Orthodox. You're getting these people, there's Arabs, 20% of the population is Arab. You're getting these people who call themselves post-Zionists, which basically means, I'm not sure exactly what it means, but it means that they no longer see Israel as coterminous with Jewishness. And then you've got the sort of Russians who are doing their gig. And then you've got hard nationalists who have a kind of deep nationalism, settlers in particular. And what you have, instead of a kind of clear definition of what it means to be Israeli surfacing given the decline of the old Ashkenazi, instead of being replaced, you just have these different identities bouncing around in a kind of global, postmodern, multicultural, choose your favorite trendy word fashion, which makes Israel a lot more like countries like Canada than you would think, where there's been this whole project designing about dethroning a particular conception of Canada and opening it up. By some accounts, the same thing is happening in Israel. The difference is that Israel remains a society that is deeply influenced and often dominated by the military and security concerns. And whoever gets to articulate what counts as security is going to be able to influence what it means to be Israeli, even if they don't actually formally redefine what it means to be Israeli. Again, almost every Israeli who's not religious or infirm somehow passes through the military.
The elephant in the room right now is the position of American Jews. What are they going to think or react to Netanyahu's victory?
Do you have any idea?
No.
I don't, I'm not an expert on American Jewish opinion, and it's not my personal community, so I would guess that they're going to hope for the best. Yeah.
I wanted just to ask you about something that
Oh, I
someone
thought you were going to give an answer to the other gentleman's question.
would answer him, but I won't in this setting. I think maybe for the first time it's become legitimate for there to be something other than the AIPAC view of life about Israel, and I think seeing how that plays out is really what's going to define. I don't think that American Jews have monolithic views about Israel anymore.
They surely don't.
Yeah, so I think that's what the future is. But I want to ask you about something else that in my mind could relate to Israel. I lived in Turkey for 5 years, and so I became somewhat familiar with the Kurdish issue. And the Kurds are an incredible people who have never had their own land. And with everything that's going on with ISIS and the Iraq War and everything else, there is the subtext of the Kurdish situation. And I've always thought in my mind that there is almost a natural bond between Israel and the Kurds. First of all, there is a historic bond in some ways. There was a significant Jewish population in Kurdistan. But I just wonder if you've thought at all about where the Kurds fit into everything that's going on and what their relationship is or could be with Israel.
Well, I believe that the Kurds are cultivating close relations with Israel, and I believe the Israelis are cultivating or reciprocating.
There are 20 million Kurds.
There are a lot of Kurds, and they're in, 4 or 5 different countries: Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey,
Iran,
and a few in Lebanon, but there's a few of everything in Lebanon. I don't mean that as a knock, there just are a few of everything in Lebanon. They got kinds of Christians I'd never heard of before. But no, I think that when this is all over, the Kurds are going to have a state. Right now they have a state. It's not a state recognized in international law. But since 2003, the Kurds have played the same game. Every time there was a deal, they cut a deal. They negotiated an arrangement that would give them more effective independence. They haven't tried to translate the effective independence into formal legal independence. But I can't imagine what it would take for the Baghdad regime that can't fight to try to break down, to regain control over the Kurdish areas inside what used to be Iraq. The other thing was, as you mentioned, the Kurds and the Turks do not have a happy history together. But about a year ago, the Kurds started letting the Turkey start. There was a pipeline constructed through Turkey that let Kurdistan, the part of Kurdistan where the Kurds are, that is called Kurdistan. There's multiple Kurdistans. That's one of the problems. But the Kurdistan in Iraq has a lot of oil. And then there are these areas right in contested areas, Kirkuk, where they're fighting over the oil. That's one of the reasons why things are pitched and tense in that particular city, because it sits on a lot of oil. But there's also substantial deposits inside, I won't say Kurdistan proper, because it's not actually proper, but it's the area where Kurds are concentrated and they will not surrender control. And the Baghdad regime claims rights to this oil. The Kurds say, yeah, right. And the Kurds, about a year ago, I believe, cut a deal with Turkey to allow for the shipment of oil from Kurdistan through Turkey through these pipelines, which I found interesting for a couple reasons. One is it gives the Kurds the material basis for effective independence. Two is it counts as a very meaningful form of recognition of Kurdish independence by the Turks. The U.S. doesn't exactly like it. The Obama regime seems to think you can put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and that it's possible to restore the integrity of the Iraqi state. And so the U.S. opposes the export of Kurdish oil to American markets on the ground that it's not really Kurdish oil, it's Iraqi oil. There was an issue last summer, I believe. I forget the details exactly, but there was this oil tanker trying to land in Galveston or someplace like this to be refined in Houston or wherever. And the U.S. government stopped that from happening because it claimed that the tanker, which was Kurdish oil, didn't have legal title to it. But at some point, right now, Obama needs the Kurds, right? The people fighting the ISIS on the ground are Kurds, Assad, Iran, and Shia militias. Who's not fighting are Sunnis and Saudis. One of the things that's going on with ISIS right now is that Americans' core diplomatic allies in the region, Sunni allies, Turkey and Saudis, are much more concerned with stopping Kurds, stopping Assad, stopping Shias than they are with stopping Iran than they are with fighting ISIS. And that is forcing Obama, I think, to reorient American diplomacy in the region. I think that's one of the reasons why they're more eager to look for a deal with Iran.
Could you comment on Netanyahu's address to Congress?
Well, I don't think he's Winston Churchill, which I gather he thinks he is. Comment upon the substance or the politics of him upstaging the President of the United States?
The politics and the upstaging of that, and also Boehner's acceptance of the invitation now to go to visit Israel. That seems to have a...
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was not, everybody talks about the partisanship in Washington. I think sometimes some of the talks about partisanship are overdrawn, to wit, both parties for the most part support Israel. But this was a provocative and insulting act by Republicans in the House and by Netanyahu. And it was hugely controversial inside Israel because, again, it seemed to be aligning Israel with one party, which violated the core precept that what Israel wants is to be close to both parties. It did serve Netanyahu's short-term advantage. My guess is that Netanyahu reckons that in a year it will be forgotten. I think for the most part he's right, for the most part, but it won't be wholly forgotten. And I don't think I actually think in a funny way it does behoove Israel if the U.S. has greater distance, because I think that would lead the U.S. to exert pressure that might ultimately serve Israeli interests. But I'm sure that's not how Netanyahu sees it. And I do think Israel made some for the most part, the bruised feelings will be forgotten, but not entirely. What I would add, I've noticed this to my surprise the last couple of years when I've been teaching Israeli politics, is the students don't have this sort of spontaneous identification with Israel. They're not hostile to it. It just seems kind of an alien place. And I think the reason it's an alien place is because elite institutions in the United States are so committed to kind of multicultural and cosmopolitan values that the intense nationalism of Israel just seems foreign to, I'm not saying to all American students, but to students at elite institutions. And given that these people are going to be having more influence than many other Americans on American governance over the next generation or two, that would concern me if I was an Israeli thinking about the long term, but I'm not an Israeli.
Some people say that if Rabin had not been assassinated, there would have been peace with the Palestinians years ago. I just wonder what you think.
What do I think? Honestly,
Could you just repeat the question?
Oh yeah, it was a good question. What would have happened if Rabin had not been assassinated? Would there have been peace with the Palestinians? And honestly, I don't know. There might have been. Rabin was a serious leader. He was credible with the kind of center of Israel. He'd been the person who actually contrived Israel's military strategies in the Six-Day War. He then had emotional issues and didn't actually lead the operations, but it was his plans that won that victory for Israel. And he was a credible figure. On the other hand, there were going to be all kinds of obstacles. I mean, when you get closer to deals in these kinds of situations, you tend to get tacit alliances between extremes on both sides. So Hamas or whoever would have provoked Israeli opinion, Israeli right would have gone and provoked Palestinians, and the attempt would have been to destroy a center. Now you still get deals sometimes. You got deals in Northern Ireland, you get deals in South Africa. You still can persevere. I think where you usually get the deals, ironically, is when the people who make the deals are not afraid of their militant flanks. So you get the deal in Northern Ireland because Paisley had nobody credible to his right among Protestants, and Sinn Féin had nobody to worry about on the left from the Catholic side. Mandela was not on the left of South African politics, but or the ANC politics, but the Communist Party was backing Mandela and backing negotiations. There wasn't really a serious challenge to the deal from a rejectionist wing of black politics or of the ANC. And conversely, the National Party had routed the Afrikaner right and didn't really have to worry by that point about being attacked from the right. Rabin's problem, I think, would have been the Israeli right operating in cahoots, as it were, with kind of Palestinian rejectionists in order so that both sides could get along and pursue a more kind of maximum agenda. I think we have time for about one more question. I think I saw, did I not see a hand to my left? Yes.
Would you mind referring for a minute to Iran and whether or not that situation had much to do with Netanyahu's election?
Do I think Iran had much to do with Netanyahu's election? I'm not sure. One reason I'm not sure is that the right is Shavit, whom I'm mentioning not just because he's an influential writer, but mostly because he's kind of emblematic of a kind of sensibility in Israeli politics. The old Ashkenazi elite, a liberal, kind of feels really badly about what happened to the Palestinians, but believes it had to happen. Considers himself a dove. He wants to. He believes that firm action, I think is the euphemism, needs to be taken against Iran. I think that there are a lot of people in the Israeli defense establishment who are not hard right, who are worried about Iran. Conversely, there are a lot of people in the Israeli defense establishment who think that it's in Israel's interest that a deal be be brokered by the U.S. to stop the production of nuclear weapons. I don't know a whole lot about nuclear weapons. I don't know a whole lot about the actual status of what Iran actually has and what it can achieve, and so on and so forth. I do, however, have a guy across the hall from me, a friend of mine who teaches, who, in his impish sense of humor, cut out a clipping from a newspaper 40 years ago where the Shah of Iran was building nuclear stuff that some people claimed could be converted into weapons. I don't think Israel can meaningfully attack Iran. I think that's the view of the American defense establishment. I think that's the view of the Israeli defense establishment, which is why they looked in the late Bush years for assistance from the U.S. The other point I would make about people attacking Iran in hopes of stopping a production of a nuclear weapon that either is or is not being assembled, I don't know. It's not just the Ayatollahs in Iran who would want a nuclear weapon. Nuclear weapons, regrettably, are seen as examples of national prestige. And the kinds of people who oftentimes want nuclear weapons in Iran are the very modern, professional, well-educated, more secular people that we would like to have govern Iran. There was an election, not the most recent election in Iran, but the one before, where there was a legitimate candidate who was kind of representing the modern middle classes and sort of was allowed to run. He was hassled, but he was allowed to run. And he was aggressively supporting the Iranian nuclear program. And I don't think he was doing so, he was an American university professor who went back to run. And I don't think he was doing so solely to appease the hard right. I think it was a sign of national pride. And nationalism is usually an ideology of middle classes. So the very kinds of people that the U.S. looks to as its potential allies in Iran are going to turn out to be the people who are going to be most upset, or at least very upset, if the U.S. attacks Iran or somebody attacks Iran to prevent the development of a nuclear weapon, which isn't to say I think it'd be a good idea if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. But I think this is a time, there's a reason why diplomacy was invented. And I think that's a perfect example of where diplomacy would be valuable. I was told we have to adjourn by 7 o'clock. Thank you very much.